live goldfish riding the rails, sealed inside the water tanks of roaring steam locomotives. Did railway engineers really trust fish to fend off disaster? In the golden age of trains, these tanks held thousands of gallons left to stagnate for days, breeding algae and worse. So railroad crews turned to hardy minnows and carp as living filters, a solution that seems absurd until you know the science behind it. But were these fish actually doomed by the machine's heat, or were they protected by an ingenious design? The truth blurs the line between myth and mechanical brilliance. It all begins with a tank that stayed cool while the boiler raged. Water inside a steam locomotive's tender doesn't simply sit idle. Each journey, the fireman manages a careful dance between reservoir and boiler, relying on a device called the injector. The process begins with a steel pipe dipping into the tender's cold water, ready to draw thousands of gallons as needed. When the boiler's pressure drops, the fireman cracks open a valve, sending a jet of live steam from the boiler through the injector. This steam races through a narrow nozzle, creating a powerful vacuum by the Venturi effect, an old trick of physics that turns steam's force into suction. As the pressure drops, water rushes from the tender, pulled into the injector's mixing chamber. Here, the steam and water collide, the steam condensing instantly, and the mix forced into a delivery pipe. But the system is built for safety as much as efficiency. Every step along this path is guarded by check valves, one-way gates that allow water to move forward but slam shut against any reverse flow. If the injector fails, or the boiler's pressure surges, these valves stop hot water or steam from ever reaching back into the cold tank. The tender and boiler remain separated by a physical and hydraulic barrier. The only water leaving the tank is what is drawn for steam, and nothing returns. From the fireman's perspective, this design means the cold water in the tender stays untouched by the heat of the boiler, except for the brief moment it is drawn into the injector. Even then, the bulk of the reserve remains at ambient temperature, shielded from the engine's inferno by steel, air gaps, and the directionality of the flow. The fish, if present, swim in water that never mingles with the scalding heart of the locomotive. The injector's pathway is a one-way street, moving water forward, never back, and keeping the worlds of cold reserve and boiling steam entirely apart. Locomotive tenders are designed to keep their water at the same temperature as the outside air, no matter how fiercely the boiler roars nearby. The separation is not just a matter of pipes and valves, it is a matter of physics and engineering. The main water tank sits behind the cab, insulated by thick steel walls and, in some cases, wooden linings. Air gaps and the sheer bulk of the water itself act as natural barriers against heat transfer. Even on long journeys, the temperature inside the tender rarely rises more than a few degrees above the weather outside. On a summer day, the water might creep up to 70 or 80 degrees Fahrenheit, but it never approaches the scalding heat of the boiler's interior. Railway crews understood this reality well. Firemen routinely checked the temperature of the tender's water by hand, dipping in a tin mug, or even their bare fingers before each run. The water always felt cool, sometimes even icy on early mornings. If the tank ever did warm up noticeably, it was usually a sign of a rare malfunction, such as a leaking injector or a stuck check valve. But these incidents were exceptions, not the rule, and the design of the system made backflow of hot water almost impossible. Most of the time, the only heat that reached the water came from sunlight beating down on the tender or from the slow, indirect transfer through several inches of steel. The firebox and boiler sat several feet away, separated by the cab and layers of air. Even after hours on the rails, the tender's water remained at ambient temperature, safe for both the crew and any aquatic hitchhikers. Fish could swim undisturbed, insulated from the engine's heat by engineering choices made decades before. For the people who worked these trains, it was common knowledge. The tender held cold water, always ready, always separate from the boiling heart of the locomotive. Steam locomotives demanded water in volumes that defy modern expectations. A typical tender hitched directly behind the engine could store anywhere from 4,000 to 10,000 gallons, enough to fill a backyard swimming pool or supply a small village for days. On major main lines, larger engines sometimes hauled even more, with double tender setups pushing capacity beyond 15,000 gallons. This water wasn't just for convenience, it was essential. Every mile traveled burned through hundreds of gallons, converted to steam, and lost to the sky with every chuff of the pistons. On a long haul, a locomotive might drain its tank in under 2 hours, forcing crews to plan refills at regular intervals. Railway companies engineered their schedules and infrastructure around these numbers. Water towers, pumping stations, and trackside troughs dotted the landscape at intervals of 20 to 30 miles, each one positioned to catch a train before its tender ran dry. In remote regions across the Canadian Shield, the American West, or the Scottish Highlands, the distances stretched further. There, tenders might sit for days, filled at a lonely siding and left to wait for the next demanding run. The sheer size of these tanks created new challenges. When water sits in a dark, sealed container for days or weeks, it stagnates. Algae can bloom, especially in summer. Mosquitoes lay eggs on the surface, and organic debris settles on the bottom. Even a tank kept tightly closed can develop foul odors and a slimy residue, especially if the previous fill came from a river or lake. With 10,000 gallons on board, any problem multiplied quickly, clogging sieves, tainting the water, and threatening the reliability of the injector system. For locomotive crews and engineers, the numbers were more than statistics. They shaped every aspect of railway logistics, from the placement of water stops to the daily routines of firemen. The massive capacity of the tender was both a lifeline and a liability, demanding constant vigilance to keep the water clean and ready for the next journey. Remote stretches of railway could turn a locomotive tender into a waiting reservoir for days on end. When a train arrived at a lonely siding in the Canadian Shield or the open plains of the American West, the water tank might be filled from a hand-pumped well, a nearby river, or a lake, whatever was available. Once loaded, that water often sat, untouched, until the engine was called for its next run. In the summer heat, the tank became a dark, sealed chamber where time seemed to slow down. With no circulation, sunlight creeping in around the hatch, and organic debris from the original source, conditions were perfect for algae to bloom. Mosquitoes found their way in through vent holes, laying eggs on the still surface. Leaves, twigs, and mud settled to the bottom, forming a layer of sludge that could foul the tender's pickup screens. On some lines, water towers and cranes were spaced 30 miles apart, but in truly distant districts, those stops might be 50 or even 100 miles away. Crews sometimes had no choice but to let water linger inside the tender, especially if the locomotive was laid over for a day or two between assignments. The longer the water sat, the greater the risk of stagnation. The firemen might open the hatch after a layover to find a musty smell, or a thin film of green clinging to the steel walls. Even with regular draining and refilling, the sheer volume, up to 10,000 gallons, meant that complete turnover was rare. Track pans, used on some American main lines, allowed locomotives to scoop water at speed, but these systems were expensive and limited to high-traffic corridors. Most rural engines relied on whatever water they could get, and whatever came with it. The result was a constant battle against fouling. If the water supply was drawn from a pond or stream, small fish sometimes arrived by accident, sucked up by the pump, and left to swim in the dark until the next refill. In other cases, crews deliberately introduced hardy species, hoping they would eat the algae and mosquito larvae before the water went bad. For the railway worker, keeping the tender's water fresh was not just about comfort or taste. It was about reliability. Stagnant water could clog injectors, slow down refills, and even threaten the engine's ability to make steam on a tight schedule. In this world, every solution, no matter how odd, was worth a try. Inside a steam locomotive tender, water was never just water. Left to sit for days, it became a perfect breeding ground for problems that went far beyond a bad smell. Algae thrived in the darkness, forming green mats that clung to the tank walls and pickup screens. Even the smallest amount of sunlight leaking through a hatch was enough to trigger a bloom, especially in summer. Mosquitoes found their way inside, drawn by the still surface. They laid eggs that hatched into wriggling larvae, turning the tank into a nursery for biting pests. Organic debris, bits of leaves, twigs, and mud, settled unnoticed at the bottom, brought in with every refill from a river or lake. Over time, this muck collected into a slimy layer that threatened to choke the tender's intake pipes. For the firemen, these were not minor annoyances. Algae and larvae could clog the fine mesh screens meant to protect the injectors, slowing the flow of water just when the engine needed it most. If the screens became blocked, the injector might fail to draw water at all. That risk could leave a locomotive stranded, unable to make steam. Worse, organic buildup in the tank could rot, releasing foul odors and tainting the water with bacteria. In the days before chemical treatments, railway crews had few options. Draining and scrubbing a 10,000-gallon tank was a back-breaking task, rarely done more than absolutely necessary. Every time water sat too long, the threat returned. A stagnant, fouled reservoir turned a lifeline into a liability. Not every fish could handle the rough world of a locomotive tender. Crews favored species that could thrive in cool, low-oxygen water and survive days without fresh food. Goldfish topped the list. Not the delicate ornamental types found in living rooms, but tough, plain-colored varieties bred for outdoor ponds. Their reputation for hardiness was well-earned. Goldfish tolerate wide temperature swings and can go weeks in murky water, eating whatever they find. Minnows, especially fathead minnows, were also common. They breed quickly and have a knack for devouring mosquito larvae before the insects ever leave the water. In some regions, small carp or even eels made appearances, especially when water was drawn from rivers, where these fish already lived. Anecdotes from British lines mention eels surviving in tenders for months, quietly grazing on algae and detritus, only meeting their end if a crew accidentally heated the tank. Railway workers did not stock tanks by the bucketful. A handful of fish, maybe a dozen goldfish or a few dozen minnows, was enough for a 5,000 or even 10,000-gallon tender. These numbers matched the natural balance seen in farm ponds, where a few fish could keep algae in check without fouling the water themselves. The fish fed on whatever the tank offered, green algae clinging to the steel walls, mosquito larvae wriggling near the surface, and bits of organic debris floating in the gloom. Their constant grazing slowed the growth of slime and kept the water clearer for weeks at a time. For firemen, it was a low-effort, low-cost fix. No chemicals, no scrubbing, just a few resilient swimmers doing what came naturally. Stories of fish in locomotive tenders rarely appear in official records, but they surface again and again in the memories of railway workers. In northern Ontario, a steam crew filling their tank from a remote lake sometimes found minnows darting through the water before the engine even left the siding. The fish arrived by accident, sucked in by the pump, but a few firemen noticed that they made quick work of the green scum and mosquito larvae that gathered in the tank during a long layover. Instead of scooping them out, crews let the fish stay, hoping for a cleaner water supply on the next run. Anecdotes from British railways add a different flavor. On the Glasgow and South Western Railway, Driver Willie Craig became known for keeping a large eel in the tender of engine 254. The eel, described as having lugs on it like a horse, was said to graze on the vegetable matter that collected in the sieves. Another tale from the same line tells of an eel that survived for months before an absent-minded crew accidentally boiled it by letting steam back into the tank. These stories passed down by word of mouth paint a picture of railway ingenuity, crews making the best of what nature and circumstance delivered. No maintenance logbooks or company memos confirmed the practice, and the fish themselves left no trace but rumor. The evidence is patchwork. A handful of oral histories, a few secondhand stories, and the occasional nod from a retired fireman. Yet across regions and decades, the same basic pattern repeats. Wherever water sat long enough to go bad, someone tried letting fish do the cleaning. While fish cars of the era hauled millions of fry across the continent in specially built tanks, the fish and locomotive tenders lived out their days in the dark, overlooked corners of railway history. The arrival of diesel power in the 1940s and 1950s swept away the world that made storing fish in a tender possible. Diesel locomotives needed no water tanks, no injectors, and no sprawling network of towers and troughs. As steam engines were retired, the vast stagnant reservoirs that once nurtured algae and minnows vanished from the rails. Water treatment advanced too. Chemical additives and filtration systems became standard even before the last steam giants left service. By the time the final mainline steam runs ended, the quirky practice of letting fish patrol the dark corners of a tender was already a fading memory, preserved only in the stories of old drivers and firemen. Yet the logic behind the idea lives on. Modern aquaponics harnesses the same relationship between fish and water, using goldfish and tilapia to control algae, and to fertilize plants in closed systems. Water treatment plants sometimes deploy fish as living monitors, signaling shifts in water quality long before machines detect trouble. Even NASA's life support research borrows these principles, studying how aquatic ecosystems might recycle waste and purify water on future space missions. A conservator at the National Railway Museum once reflected on these stories, pointing out that while evidence is thin, the impulse behind them is clear. Railway workers improvised with what they had, trusting nature to solve problems that technology had not yet conquered. Today, the ethics of animal welfare loom larger, and the idea of keeping fish in a railway tank feels quaint, even troubling. But in the era before synthetic chemicals and automated pumps, a handful of goldfish or an eel in the dark was a practical, if imperfect, answer to a daily challenge. The legacy is not in the tanks themselves, but in the ingenuity and adaptability of the people who kept the trains running. Nature's solutions often outpace our own inventions, sometimes hiding in plain sight. As we confront water scarcity and pollution today, biofiltration and closed-loop systems echo those forgotten experiments on the rails. The legacy isn't folklore, but proof that sustainable answers can be simple, even improbable. Innovation still begins by looking closely at the world we share. What overlooked idea might solve tomorrow's challenges?